Hello, and welcome to Central Booking, where writers and readers are the authority. I'm your host, John Valeri. Today, I'm joined in conversation by Connecticut author William J. McGee, but there are no formalities here, so we'll just call him Bill. Bill's first novel, Half the Child, was published in 2018. The book, about a single father fighting for custody of his son and learning the harsh truths about parental alienation, was a semifinalist for both the James Jones First Novel Competition and the William Faulkner Creative Writing Competition. Bill is no stranger to publication, however. He is both an award-winning investigative journalist and columnist, and wrote Attention All Passengers, a nonfiction expose on the airline industry published by HarperCollins in 2012. Additionally, Bill represents travelers as a consumer advocate in Washington and is the former editor-in-chief of Consumer Reports Travel Letter. He also worked in airline flight operations management and served in the U.S. Air Force Auxiliary. Bill has an MFA in fiction from Columbia University and teaches creative writing at both the undergraduate and graduate levels. Half the Child, then, is the fulfillment of a longtime passion for fiction. Catherine Taylor, author of Valley Fever and Rules for Saying Goodbye, praised, "William J. McGee's magnificent novel is everything a reader could want in a book. Heartbreaking, hilarious, emotionally raw, and still packed with suspense on every page. This is a laugh through your tears kind of novel, a story of fathers and sons, family and friendship, and the frequent tragedy of romantic love. An absolutely wonderful achievement." Bill is currently at work on a second novel and is also developing a scripted television drama. But of all the roles he's embodied, author, advocate, and educator among them, the one he's most proud of is father. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Central Booking. Today, I am talking to William J. McGee, one of Connecticut's authors. He has written the book Half the Child, which was a semi-finalist for both the James Jones First Novel Competition and also the William Faulkner Creative Writing Competition, which is quite impressive on the show tonight. So welcome to it. Bill, we'll call you Bill, I guess, for the sake of this interview. It's nice to have you here.
John, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure. I was telling you actually before we started recording that it was kind of refreshing to read this book just because I tend to read a lot of mystery and thriller, and so I tend to get pitched a lot of mystery and thriller, and I absolutely love it, but there are all sorts of other horror stories in life that are a little bit more generalized, so it was a refreshing change of pace for me, so I enjoyed the reading experience regardless of the subject matter. And for people who don't know, just to briefly frame the book, it's really about a gentleman named Michael Mullen who basically he unexpectedly finds himself a single parent. His son Benjamin is abducted by his ex-wife or soon-to-be ex-wife, and he has to go through sort of a whole process both emotionally to come to terms with this, but also fighting for custody of Benjamin. And so I wanted to ask you, generally, what inspired you to want to tackle this book? And you yourself are a father, so can you speak to how you're able to, use your experiences as a father to create an emotional resonance to this book? Because I found it very emotionally resonant.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And yeah, it's an interesting thing. I had an agent who was trying to sell the book 2 years ago, and he did a lot of research into the book market. And we found, incredibly, that there hasn't been a novel published in the United States about custody or divorce or anything having to do with children since 1973 from a father's perspective. There's been nonfiction written, but the last novel published in the United States was Kramer versus Kramer, which many people maybe remember from the movie Meryl Streep. And so that sort of blew me away. It's been, almost 50 years since anyone really had a novel on a bookshelf about a father's love and a father's experience. And so, I do a lot of different things. I'm a novelist, I'm a journalist, I'm a teacher, I do a lot of stuff. I'm a consumer protection advocate, but my most important role is being a father, and my son is an adult, and he's the love of my life, and he's also the guy that keeps everything going for me as my IT specialist and my webmaster and all of that, and helps me with social media. but there's nothing more important to me than being a father. And I just, as a father, and particularly as a single father over the years, I got really annoyed over time, and I found out many others did too, with depictions in commercials and from Madison Avenue and from movies and TV of fathers either being idiots or being distanced from their kids. And I know in past generations, things were different. It certainly was with my father. But all the fathers I know now are devoted to their kids, and they're not, wrapped up in their careers and just sort of spend 5 minutes a day with their kids. And I wanted to write about a father's love, really. And so um, the interesting thing is, I was told, or rather, my agent was told by just about all the major publishers in the industry that there was no market for this book because the conventional wisdom is that only women buy books and only women read books. So apparently every man in the United States is illiterate and an idiot, and all those things that are behind your head right there, those don't exist, okay? Men don't read books. So of course, we argued about that and said that that's not true. But the really interesting thing is that the response to Half the Child, so much of the positive responses, even if you just go to Amazon or Goodreads, have been coming from women. So much for what the publishing industry knows. We were told there's no market because women wouldn't be interested in reading about a loving and caring dad. And guess what? They're all, women are falling in love with Michael Mullen because he's such a devoted dad. And I'll share with you, John, Michael recently got a marriage proposal through me. A woman wrote me and said, I would marry him tomorrow. I had to break the news to her that he's fictional. He doesn't exist except in my head. So much for that. But yeah, so being a father is the most important thing to me. And I just really wanted to chronicle how much fatherhood has changed, certainly in America in recent years, and how important, fatherhood is to so many men.
Sure. I think you accomplished that very well. And obviously, rendered it quite believably if people believe this character is so real that they want to marry him. So that's something. And you touched on this a bit, but I wanted to ask you too, there's so much gender inequality, and more often than not, it's male privilege, that we're thinking about, and male privilege that exists. And perhaps maybe the one place that that's not the case is the family court system, in which case it's sort of the opposite. So can you talk about, the inequalities that exist in the family court system and how Michael sort of experiences this unexpectedly as he's fighting for custody? His child has been abducted and he's finding that people are throwing walls up in front of him, even though he's not the one who left the country with the kid.
Right. Well, you put it very well. I mean, that's it, and, I made a decision to write this novel in first person. So it's told from Michael's perspective. We're always inside Michael's head and no one else's. And I also made a decision, which is fairly rare. You don't see a lot of novels in present tense. Most are in past tense. And I made both those decisions on purpose because I wanted to sort of just get a sense of Michael with blinders on. Where we, the reader, we're all experiencing what he's experiencing in real time as he experiences it. And, the bottom line is he's very naive because he keeps thinking, well, I'm a good father. I love Ben. Ben loves me. How can we go wrong? I'll go into court. This is America. We all get our chance to talk. And, the deck is stacked against him. And, you bring up the gender issue and you're right. I mean, I'm a strong supporter of Me Too. I'm a strong supporter of women. I have so many women in my life. I have 6 sisters. I mean, I'm close to so many women, female friends, female bosses. And yet this is one area where there is tremendous bias against men. I'll also point out, and I want to be very clear about this, I've seen the concept of parental alienation, which we'll probably talk a little bit about, and I've seen unfair custody also hurt women. Sometimes it's about who has more money. I have a woman very close to me in my life who has experienced some of the trauma that Michael has experienced. She's the mother, but she still is sort of always playing catch up in court. And that's Michael's experience. Every time Michael thinks, the book takes place over 4 consecutive summers when Ben is 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. And every time Michael thinks, okay, things are about to get better. Things are about to, we're going to, things are going to quiet down, and we're finally going to have some normalcy here. Everything blows up again, and it's like, he's reaching to, for this goal of having his son in his life, and he keeps getting further and further away, and that becomes the central theme of the novel. Will Ben and Michael be united? And he is naive intentionally. I mean, that's how I wrote it, because I think, who in their right mind would go into a relationship or have a child thinking that it's all going to blow up and it's going to, the worst case is going to happen. Most of us, go into marriage and relationships and parenthood with the best and highest of intentions. And then when it goes wrong, you're sort of thrown to the court. The bottom line, it's an old story. It's about money, the court system and the whole child custody system, the lawyers, the judges, the psychologists, everyone involved in it. It's a $1 trillion industry with a T, and it just, it's not putting the children first, which is what it should be. And so many of us have sort of become advocates for shared parenting, which is a pretty simple concept. We're not talking about terrible parents. We're not talking about violent parents or, parents who have substance abuse problems, things like that. But if a kid has two loving parents in their life, they should have access to both. And you'd be shocked how often that just doesn't happen.
Yeah, sure. No, it's very unfortunate. And I think that, this book was very enlightening for somebody who is not a parent, but who is, witnessed parenthood around him. Yeah, I mean, you don't really think about how the deck is stacked against you. And really it is about power and money. And it is, like so many things, a business. Unfortunately, it's the business of people's lives and, children who need advocates and who are pretty much the most vulnerable. And, when you were speaking, you mentioned the term parental alienation and said that we might talk about it. And you were correct, sir, because that was my next question for you.
How did I know?
Yeah, I know. It's like you knew, but I saw that you had posted something on your social media, I want to say yesterday, about the term parental alienation. And I think that you'd mentioned that you were writing a novel about it and had not heard the term until you were, deep into the work. So can you tell us, what that is and how Michael experiences it throughout the book?
Sure. So when Half the Child was published, because I ran into so many difficulties trying to get it published, I eventually made the decision to self-publish. I had been published before. My first book, I'll shamelessly hold it up. It's a nonfiction expose on the airline industry and aviation safety. It's called Attention All Passengers, and it was published traditionally by HarperCollins, and you see it's endorsed by Sully Sullenberger, the captain that landed on the Hudson River, and Ralph Nader. Ralph Nader, who I first met right in Connecticut in West Hartford at Barnes and Noble. And I've come to know very well since then. And so, I had been traditionally published before. And when I went into self-publishing, of course, this became, an overnight crash course in all the things that HarperCollins did for me with my first book, I was suddenly doing for myself. So I went out and didn't have a big budget, but I tried to hire some good people. And obviously I got a great artist to do the cover for Half the Child, and a great editor, and a great photographer, and a great, person to help with publicity and all of that. And as I was going through the process, I, started reading different things about promoting books, and everybody says, go on social media, go on social. So I started up a ton of social media sites, some in my name, William J. McGee, some in Half the Child's name. And I started getting hits from these different groups on parental alienation. And I'm not ashamed to say this, John. The novel was done. It was in this form. It was ready to go. And I had to Google the term parental alienation. I said, what's that? And I said, oh, that's my novel. Now, I mean, there may be people saying, boy, this guy's not too bright. He wrote a novel about a subject and never heard of it. I think that's the thousands of people. They don't know that this thing has a name. Parental alienation, basically, it's sort of a controversial subject within some psychological circles and even some legal circles. There are those that are very strong proponents of it, those that say, no, it doesn't exist. I'm strongly in the camp to say, oh, no, it exists. I've seen it. It most definitely exists. And basically, it's a parent, often one with, psychological issues, who is unreasonably trying to prevent the child and the other parent from being in each other's lives. In this case, it's a rather extreme example, and after child, it's abduction. But it may be much more subtle. It may be just canceling visitation or not being available for phone calls and things like that. It does tremendous psychological harm to the child, and of course, it does tremendous harm to the other parent as well. Um, and so suddenly, I'm like, oh, I wrote a book about parental alienation. Now I know it has a name. I didn't, again, I know there may be people thinking like, this guy is not the brightest, but I really didn't know. And so once I did, and I sort of risked that, I wound up last year going to Philadelphia, and I spoke before the world's largest parental alienation group. It's called PASG, Parental Alienation Support Group. And I spoke before a room of about 200, mostly, most of the people in the room were either in mental health, psychologists and counselors, or attorneys, but many of them were either parents who had experienced it, or some, and I found this very interesting, were children like Ben who are now adults, but who had been separated from a parent through abduction or other means when they were 3, 4, 5, and in many cases hadn't seen their parents in 30 or 40 years.
Right.
And it was like no other reading I've ever done in my life. I've done a lot of readings, and I've done a lot of, readings at book clubs and libraries and all kinds of places and podcasts and folks like yourself. But this was, an experience I'd never had. 200 people, and I was reading passages from the book, and there were tears everywhere. I couldn't look up because every time I looked up, someone was crying.
Mm.
And so I sort of connected with this community. And now, I won't say I'm a reluctant advocate because I'm happy to do it, but I was sort of a side door advocate. I didn't write this novel and say I'm going to become an advocate on this topic, but as someone said to me recently, advocacy finds you very often. So the irony is, in my sort of day life, I'm a consultant to Consumer Reports. I've been with them for 20 years, and I'm their aviation and travel person. So I'm used to being an advocate for air travelers, right? So I'm the person that goes to Congress and fights for you for airline safety and to get refunds when they won't give you your refunds back, like they're doing now during COVID, and all kinds of other things. So the seats aren't so tight. I'm that person. I go to Congress and I get beat up, by the airlines for doing that. So I've been an advocate, but I didn't know I was going to become a parental alienation advocate. But I really look at it very simply. I'm really just an advocate for what's right, and you have to put the kids first. And if a kid has a good parent in their life, not an abusive parent, not a terrible parent, they want to be with them. And how can you not allow that to happen? So now I'm talking about parental alienation all the time, but I came to it through a very odd way, after writing about it.
It's kind of funny, these are the unexpected things that happen. And, everybody says they write the books and then the real work begins. You think that writing the book is the work, but,
Right.
Sometimes it just sort of paves a pathway for what comes next. And I think I should, tip the virtual hat to you also for being our consumer advocate in terms of airlines, because that, as you mentioned, can't always be a very pleasant thing. And yet it's very much appreciated by the people who are actually passengers, travelers, citizens on these planes.
Mm-hmm.
So kudos to you and a thank you for that.
Thank you. It's hard work, and it's, we're outgunned, we're outspent. Consumer Reports, for those that don't know, not to turn it into commercial for them, but they're the world's largest nonprofit consumer organization. So most people know Consumer Reports magazine, and no advertising, no funds in any way from any profit corporation. But I work on the advocacy side out of the Washington office. And, when we go to Congress or we go before the Department of Transportation or the Federal Aviation Administration, on the other side of the airlines, and they're a $1 billion industry, and they have huge sacks of money that they throw around, to both parties and to, the House and the Senate and presidential candidates in the White House. And we don't use money. We just use arguments. And so it's tough work because, I've gone to Congress and, they're always polite and they always listen, but, that money talks. And so, those of us that are out there sort of in the trenches with this, it can be disheartening, So that's why I mentioned Ralph Nader before. I'm not trying to name drop, but I appeared with him at an event at the National Press Club last year on airline safety. And we were doing a Q&A, and I said to him, I've done a tiny little fraction of consumer advocacy compared to the person that talk about inventing a term. He invented consumer advocacy, And I said to him, how do you do it? How do you just like not give up the fight after all the years, you know? And his answer was so simple. He just looked at me and said, well, I want a better world. It's like, how are you going to argue with that? You know, it just was very humbling. You know, I was like,
Sure.
okay, you know, how can I complain? You know, so we'll keep on. But it just, you know, with airline travel, I mean, the safety issues are so black and white in some cases. And, um, you know, you just have to keep fighting because you have to hope that eventually enough people will, you know, learn about things and say, well, wait, that's not acceptable. So it can be slow going, but eventually I hope that, you know, our messages are heard, you know.
Absolutely. And yes, Ralph Nader, that was a great answer. Talk about perspective right there.
Right,
Right. How can you argue that?
right. He
Uh,
literally was advocating before I was born. And I'm thinking, you know, like I said, I mean, I've done, you know, I would never in a million years compare myself to him, but I've been before Congress many times and, you know, I don't go there to lose. I'd like to win for consumers. And a lot of times we do lose and it's disheartening. You know, I go home and I'm like, well, you know, why bother? And then you have to say, no, you know, why bother? The stakes are so high, you know, you have to keep fighting.
Sure, sure. And I did want to ask you a little bit more about Michael too. And he, not so coincidentally, does work in air traffic control at LaGuardia. So in a minute, I'll probably ask you, how you were able to sort of draw on your own background for that. But I wanted to ask you too, for his character, you see him going through this really difficult situation, and there's a physical toll to it. There's an emotional toll to it, and he's really struggling. And fortunately, he's got a very supportive family and he finds some means to be able to sort of build himself back up. He's in therapy. He has a potential love interest. He takes up boxing, which I think that you've done as well. So can you
Yeah.
talk about, the physical and emotional aspects that you wanted to show within his character, but also how he's able to use some of the resources at his disposal so that despair doesn't win in the end?
What a great question. Thank you. Yes, because that's exactly what I was trying to do here is through the course of these 4 summers, the book is more or less divided into 4 equal sections, give or take. But these 4 consecutive summers where things just keep getting worse and worse. First, it starts out, he and his ex-wife are separated, and then it leads to divorce, and then it leads to a custody struggle, and then it leads to abduction. So each summer things are getting worse, and Michael's life keeps getting worse. And so it has negative effects, this custody struggle and the abduction, on virtually every area of his life, physically, emotionally, mentally, financially. He winds up, virtually homeless because of all of his legal bills, but he has a big family, and his brother takes him in, and he's sleeping on his brother's sofa for a year. His work, so yes, full disclosure, air traffic controller. I am not a former air traffic controller, but I worked with them. I worked in airline flight operations for about 7 years. I did work at LaGuardia and Kennedy and other airports, and I used to talk to air traffic controllers all day. I was a dispatcher for airlines, and I know you're not going to believe it. Many people don't, but I wasn't going to have an aviation angle in this book. I thought, Half the Child is going to be my first work that doesn't have airplanes in it. And then about 6 months into writing, I said, who am I kidding? I actually, in the first draft, Michael was a salesman. And I just thought, no, I need him to have a job that, one, is stressful. Okay, air traffic control. 2, is high stakes. Well, yeah, it's life and death. And 3, if he messes up, if you mess up as a salesman, you may not know it until the next quarter or something, 6 months down the road. But if you mess up as an air traffic controller, you're going to know within about 10 seconds,
Right.
And so Michael is sort of an air traffic controller. He's an air traffic controller. He's very professional. He was an air traffic controller in the military and at LaGuardia. And, even people that aren't crazy about him, will respect his work. And he's always had the ability, when he walks up into the tower, to shut everything else out and just focus on the plane. First time in his life, um, he is, in fact, his problems outside the tower are bleeding into his work because of Ben and because of the abduction. And I won't give anything away, and I know you won't, but there's a very dramatic scene that happens where he's up in the tower and he becomes distracted. And obviously, it's bad enough to be distracted on the highway, but distracted in the air traffic control tower, not acceptable. And it's all because of the situation with Ben. So he's in some ways, to use a term that's much in use these days. He's privileged in that, he has family, and family is there for him, and he has friends, and he has a support system. But in many ways, he couldn't be less privileged because the courts keep ruling against him, and it's just, he's going bankrupt, and he's also becoming more and more clinically depressed to the point of suicidally depressed. He misses his son so much. So I really wanted to chronicle over time how he's sort of all in. And despite all this, he just says, there's no way I'm walking away from Ben, I'll die first, and he means it. It's not just an idle threat, And I know an awful lot of parents like that, fathers and mothers who, they'll never walk away from their kids. And so I wanted to sort of chronicle that type of love. And I think, even the term custody battle, it implies parent versus parent. It sounds very simplistic. I'm not trying to be simplistic, but if the kid's interest is put first, then the rest will fall into place. Like, do what's right for the kid, and then you figure out your life, And but that's hard when you're dealing with someone on the other side who may be narcissistic or psychologically damaged in some way and just doesn't think about the kid first, So.
Sure. And it's funny that you say that initially Michael wasn't an air traffic controller, but it works so well in the book because I don't think I'd ever considered what a high stress job that is. And of course it is, because you are responsible for the safety of the crew, the passengers, and you have all this stuff going on in your outside life that of course is going to intrude, and you have all this chatter in your head. So yeah, that was just really, really well done, and I found that it really added to the story. So I think that was a good decision in this case to write what because like you said, yeah, if he didn't meet his quota of numbers, someone might
Right.
get back to him at his annual review on that.
Right. It's like, is it the end of the world? It's
Right.
funny, when I left working in the airlines, I worked in airline flight operations, and I'm not being dramatic, but it was a life and death business. We didn't talk about it in those terms, but we all understood the stakes. And then I got into journalism, and I started working at magazines and writing about travel and aviation. And every Friday or Thursday when the magazines were being put to bed and sent out, everybody acted like it was life and death. And I remember one time I turned to somebody and I said, my last job was life and death. This isn't. If the magazine arrives on Tuesday instead of Monday, then really, I get it. It's not a good thing, but I mean, it's not like an airplane coming out of the sky, And so, I had some people say to me, "Oh, of course, your novel, has an airline component." I'm like, I didn't do it intentionally, but you said it, right? Which and I thought, yeah, I do know that world. And, again, I mean, Michael's always had the ability to sort of just be completely focused. And that speaks to just how dramatic these events are. For the first time, he could have a fight with his wife, or he could have a fight with someone else, or whatever. He got money problems. He gets up there and it's all about talking to the planes, By the way, speaking of talking to the planes, I haven't mentioned this to you, John, but as we speak, they're finishing the audio version of Half the Child. So there's, obviously the print, and there's a Kindle version, but now there's an audio version, and it's being done by a great guy who lives out on Long Island, and he is also from Queens, like me. So, he and Michael is from Queens, I should say, and obviously with LaGuardia Airport, and most of the scenes are set in Queens in the novel, and so I can't wait to hear it. And we met last year for several hours. We had dinner, and I walked him through the air traffic control, cadences of how, air traffic controllers, you'll never hear them be dramatic. You'll never hear them raise their voice. I mean, you can go on YouTube and you can listen to actual real world events like Sullenberger's flight on the Hudson River, where I've gotten to know the air traffic controller. We became friends on Facebook, Patrick Harton, who was talking to Sullenberger. And you never hear, oh my God, what's happening? They're always, and also as few words as possible.
Sure.
Time is of the essence. So we went over that, and so he's a really good reader. I've heard his work, so I can't wait to hear the audio version.
Oh, that's exciting. Yeah, it's like a whole different experience sometime to get like the auditory feedback. That's definitely something to look forward to. And I love too how, the book is a couple of years old, but it lives on and it sort of becomes reincarnated. So that's most
Right.
excellent. I do want to ask you one more question, sort of specifically about the book, and then if you don't mind, maybe move into some general topics.
Sure.
But you've mentioned a couple times, and it was something that I noted, that the structure of the book, it's set, it's 4 books, 4 segments over 4 years. And what I really liked that you did is it's basically broken down into sort of Benji's developmental areas. So, it starts with colors and then numbers and language and concepts. So even though, things are falling apart from segment to segment and Michael's life kind of gets worse and worse, it's framed in a very positive way, about the growth that his son is making. And I think that that sort of is the underlying, thrust of the book. So can you talk about if that was what you intended to do all along, or just how you sort of see the structure of the book enhancing the narrative that you wanted to tell?
Yeah, originally, in the very earliest draft, it was just one summer. It was set in a summer, and then I realized it was a bigger story than that. So I expanded it beyond the first summer. But in that first summer, Ben is 2.5, and it's all about colors, And I don't think you need to be a parent. I think if you've been around kids as an aunt, an uncle, sibling, whatever, friends, you know, that kids can be very obsessive. They get locked on something, and and then they stay on it for a while. They go through phases. And as Michael says, this may not be true for bad parents, but for good parents, you learn as much or more than you're ever going to teach them. And Michael's constantly learning from Ben, because you start seeing the world from the eyes of a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, and things that as adults we would walk right by. And now Michael is stopping and looking at a squirrel, which when would he ever do that before? He's a busy guy. He has to go talk to airplanes. And now, Ben's like, look at that squirrel, or look at that tree, or look at that, and hey, you're right, and he stops, And so, the first summer is colors, as you said, and then numbers, and then everything becomes counting. And they're counting sticks, and they're counting sand at the beach, and they're counting fish sticks, that they're eating. And then the words and the language, it becomes he's 4. The hardest sections to write were when Ben is 5, because it becomes concepts. And Michael is constantly underestimating his son. He keeps thinking, well, Ben doesn't really get this. And we haven't really talked about the title, but I should mention, since we're talking about Connecticut, and you and I are both in Connecticut, I'm not an artist. Eric Hofston, wonderful artist up in Maine, he did the cover. I'm biased, obviously, but I think he did a great job. But it is my idea, and you don't want to see my rough sketch because I couldn't, I can't draw a circle. But the idea came on I-95 here in the New Haven area where I live. And I was stuck in bumper-to-bumper traffic, and I was behind a minivan. And it had those little characters that you see there, a little mommy and a little daddy and a boy and a girl and a cat and a dog and whatever. And I was just, staring at this thing for 20 minutes in bumper-to-bumper traffic, as I-95 often has, or at least before COVID. Right. And I thought, I know it's a dark thought, but I thought, gee, if they get divorced, what happens to those little figures, And so that's, if you could see, there's a mom on one car and a dad on the other, and a child cut in half, right? And so in that 4th section, when Ben is 5, they make a reference to the biblical story of King Solomon, who, it's really sort of the first recorded custody battle in history, the legend of King Solomon in the Old Testament or in the Talmud, of 2 women fighting over a baby, and King Solomon says, give me a sword and I'll cut the child in half. And of course, the woman who is the actual mother says, no, let her have it. It's a chilling story. It moves me every time I read it, And so Ben stumbles on this story, and Michael says, oh, he gets him off the subject. That's too complicated for him to understand. As it turns out, Ben understands the concept of half the child better than Michael ever dreams, and I'll just leave it at that. But, the concept of how to, courts are set up to divide houses and bank accounts and cars and boats and all kinds of stuff. But when it comes to children, they don't do a good job.
Sure. And actually, mentioning the cover kind of is a nice transition to something I wanted to ask you about. And you, a little bit earlier, spoke to why you ended up self-publishing this book, because you were basically told that there probably wouldn't be a market for it, traditionally. And the interesting thing I've seen in the last 20 years is there's sort of been a complete shift in terms of how we perceive self-publishing, and it's a much more legitimate avenue now than it was when it was new. But there are sort of best practices, for instance, a nice eye-catching cover, editorial feedback. So for people who are considering their options and who might want to self-publish, can you talk a little bit about what those best practices are and what the things are that they really need to consider before they rush a product out to the marketplace?
Sure, sure. I'd be happy to do that. I think the biggest advantage I had is that I did have a book published traditionally, as I mentioned. So, Attention All Passengers, this was published in 2012, and, major publisher, HarperCollins. And, there was a team of people doing everything. There's an audio book for that too. They took care of everything. They took care of the publicity. They assigned a publicist to me, and I went and made the rounds at CNN and NPR's Fresh Air for an hour and Fox and you name it, and, talking about airline safety and all of that. And what did I have to do except show up, and I certainly didn't. I wasn't on the phone with Barnes and Noble or anyone else, all of that, the distribution. And now suddenly with Half the Child, I had high hopes. So did my agent. We thought, it's a book that, as you mentioned, it's been a semifinalist for some major award competitions. And, the people who read it, who I respect, writers who were giving me blurbs were very supportive and thought, it's going to do well. And then we ran up against, this phenomenon of being told that there's no market for a book about a loving father. So writers are full of self-doubt. We're used to being rejected. I've received my share. I could wallpaper my living room with rejections. Who couldn't? But something just didn't sound right. And so I reached out to a small circle of published writers who are friends and just said, we have a rule to be honest, is if the work isn't good enough, then, it's one thing. But they all said, no, something's wrong, the book is good and it should find a home somewhere. So I made the decision to self-publish. But, you pointed it out, John, 10 years ago, that would have been a very dangerous decision. 20 years ago, it would have been unthinkable, I think you mentioned the word stigma, and that's exactly what it is. There was a time where if you self-published, it was basically saying you're not good enough to be published, and it's just not the case now. There's so many great books that are being self-published. And, I'm not in any way trying to sound sour grapes, but there's also a lot of dysfunction in the publishing industry, and a lot of it is guesswork. They don't know what books are going to do well and which aren't. But in the past, they would publish more books. Right. So there was a better chance of, well, if we publish, keep the numbers simple, we publish 20 books this month and 3 do really well, that'll sort of help all 20. Now it's like everything has to be a home run, everything has to be, something that's going to be knocked out of the park. And that's very hard to do, particularly with fiction, where you can't really always predict, So once I made the decision to self-publish, and I sort of crossed, it was not an easy decision to make. It took me a long time to finally say, okay, we're sort of throwing in the towel with the agent and trying to get it published in traditional way. Once I made that decision, I never looked back. And I have to tell you, it was very liberating. Sure. And first thing I did is I went back and I added in some scenes that had been taken out at the request of my agent. I thought, well, you know what? If I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down with my way, And, but, again, I didn't have a big budget, but I would strongly advise anyone who's thinking about self-publishing to invest. I found, a great editor, my friend Lynn Bernstein, who I've known for many years, and she edited it. And I said to her, hey, listen, when we go back a long way, I'm a writer. I've taught creative writing for 10 years. This is a pretty clean manuscript. You'll be lucky if you find a couple of things. Wow. She then sent me like a 9-page email when I printed it out, right? And I'm like, oh yeah, right, okay. Don't let anybody ever say no one needs an editor, right? We all need editors, We all need editors. We all need another set of eyes. She found so many things, and oh yeah, right, okay. Some were important, some, just punctuation and things, but we all need editors. And and of course, as I said, a good artist. When you go on, online on Amazon or wherever, and you see just sort of, Half the Child in black lettering on a white page, it looks self-published. My goal, quite frankly, was if somebody picked up this book anywhere, at a bookstore, at a reading, whatever, they wouldn't pick it up and say, "Oh, this guy's self-published." It's not until they look and they say, I mean, to me, it looks professional. And that was my goal. So don't skimp on those things. And then, once you're sure that the content, the editing is good, and the artwork and the layout and all of that, the designer of the cover also designed every page to make sure that all the publishing things, that there aren't those widows where you have one word on a page, etc.
Right.
Then I also talked to a publicist, and I got a professional photo done and all that. And the publicist was great too, and he put together press releases and sent stuff out. It's very hard to write a press release about yourself,
Yes.
you sound like an egomaniac, This guy, Bill McGee, he's a great writer, would you like to talk to him? Well, you are talking to him, you can't do that,
Right.
So, so I basically, I thought back to my experience with HarperCollins with my first book, and I said, okay, so there was a whole team of people, professionals. What did they do? And I broke it down piece by piece. And I said, well, some did the illustrations, some did the editing, some did this, the publicity. And then I said, okay, I'm going to go find, on my budget, which is, modest, I'm going to go find people to do that for me. And so you can't underestimate how important that is. I mean, look, you can self-publish online. You can publish in a week if you'd like, that doesn't mean that you should,
Right.
so, and there are folks that maybe are just writing a book for a few close friends or something, and that's fine. But if you're looking, as I am, to have this book go out into the world and people to read it, then you need to make that investment, in my opinion,
Sure. Absolutely. And then if you don't, you sort of give it a bad name for all the people who are doing their due diligence.
Exactly.
And another thing that you mentioned that I think is very true is when you are self-publishing, yes, there are, absolute challenges that come with that a traditional publisher would usually take care of you, take care of for you, but also, the creativity, the creative liberty that you have to actually believe in your story 100%, put in those scenes that you think that really should be
Right.
there, that somebody might
Right.
not agree with you. But
Right.
it's a definite balance. And if you put in the work and you do it right, I'll tell you, I had to double check to make sure it was self-published because it looked, like you said, I mean, it looks great. It's edited really terrifically. So
Well,
kudos.
thank you. That was my goal. So that's the highest compliment you can give. Look, you're never going to have 100 people out of 100 like a given work, particularly with fiction. It gets subjective, but just wanted to say this is a serious book and it's being published seriously, and I can't control the editors and the agents who passed on it, but I can just try and get it out there in the world, and that's all you ask, is for people to read it and say, yeah, I like it, and take it from there.
Sure. And so I did want to ask you, because you mentioned a little bit ago that you also have taught writing. So you've taught creative writing to undergraduates, graduates, and I'm always interested to hear, what is it that you think that actually can be taught versus what is intrinsic to a person, and how can discipline or tenacity sort of factor into that equation?
Well, that's a great question, and I think there are sort of, over the years, there were two schools of thought, particularly years ago with some older writers, that there was a sort of standard line: you can't teach writing. It's not like physics or biology or what have you. And to an extent, I agree. To an extent, I strongly disagree too. I was an undergraduate. When I was an undergraduate at Hofstra University on Long Island in the 1980s, I majored in creative writing. And that was in the Reagan years, where people were like, oh my gosh, what are you going to do with that degree? Everybody seemed to be majoring in business in those years, And then later, about 10 years later, after I went out and traveling around the world and worked in aviation and whatnot, and got married and had a son, I went back to graduate school at Columbia University, and I got my Master of Fine Arts, also in creative writing and fiction. And, I often say I was an undergraduate, I learned how to take criticism in the writing workshops. And I followed that up with, when I was a graduate student at Columbia, I learned how to reject criticism, which can be just as important, okay? And I didn't really know that until I got there. And then I started teaching writing at my alma mater at Hofstra University on Long Island. And I taught there for about 10 years, and both fiction and nonfiction, and both uh, undergraduate and graduate. And look, when someone doesn't have sort of the basic skills, there's only so much you can do. But I worked with those students too to just sort of make their work as good as can be. But I think we can all benefit from sharing our work. From I know I did. From the workshop process. Like I say, there used to be sort of old cranky writers who said they never should never read your work in a classroom. Just go out and publish it. Well, good luck with that. That's not always an option these days. But if you have an open mind and you're trying to make your work better, then that feedback can be invaluable. I loved my experience, in graduate school, and I have a lot of students who I'm still in touch with on social media and even in person, and former students, and many of them are writers now, and they thank me for me working with them, and um, I do think it's all about keeping an open mind and just and like I say, that process of learning to accept criticism, learning to reject criticism, um, I have friends that are writers, and we read each other's work, and we have a pact that we'll only be honest. We're friends, but no, this isn't working. We don't just say, oh yeah, it's great. That's not being a good friend if you're a writer. It's like
No,
you
it's
have
not.
to be able to say, there's a problem here. Whatever that problem is.
Sure. Uh, and dare I ask you, so I know there's the huge debate. I mean, you have an MFA, and people will say it's been the greatest help to their career. Other people I know say it's the biggest hindrance. What say you?
Right. Yes. Well, I'll be honest. I mean, I had sort of two goals when I went to get the MFA. One was, you know, to improve my work and to have that sort of discipline. At that point in my life, I sort of needed the deadlines and everything. If you give me a deadline, I'm great, even as a journalist. If you give me a deadline of next summer, forget it. I'll be doing it next summer. But if you say to me, look, we need, you know, 500 words by next Friday or 1,000 words by next Monday. Okay, you got it. Once I agree, I actually do a trick where sometimes where someone's vague with me about a deadline, I give myself one and we lock it in, and I send an email. Okay, you'll get it on Tuesday the 1st, and there it is. It's on my calendar the 1st. But the other thing with the MFA was that in academic circles, the Master of Fine Arts as opposed to an MA is what they call a terminal degree. So you don't need to go on and get a PhD. So it allows you to teach. Um, my timing is not great. I'm publishing a novel in an era when fewer novels are getting published. I became an adjunct professor when when adjunct professors are not being treated very well. I became a journalist at a time when journalistic institutions are laying off droves of people. My timing is not great on a lot of things. And then there's the consumer advocacy at an era when corporate America's got more bucks to spend than ever. It seems like all the things I've chosen to do and I love to do involve a struggle. That's the theme, in my life. But I loved being an adjunct professor, but I have to say, they're not treated well. I wasn't treated well, and others are not being treated well. And it used to be that you could sort of find a home. Many writers I know who were older, who were mentors to me, they started teaching and they had that sort of home, and they used that as their base, and it gave them the time and the resources to work on, I'm always out hustling. I'm always like working on, journalism and all these other things. And I wish I had more time to write fiction, and I have to steal the time. I've not a joke. I've sort of half jokingly said, well, half the child, about 80% of it was written after the hour of 10 p.m. And it's true. This is a novel that was written on nights and weekends,
Right.
and that's just the way it is. But, when you have to write, you have to write. And it's hard to explain to someone that doesn't understand, it's not about the money. It's not about anything other than you have to write. And I'm
I
someone
think
who
you say
has
the
to
money.
write.
What money?
Exactly. Uh, I had a terrible experience with my accountant a few years ago. We were going over, my taxes, and I said, "Well, I'm a novelist," and she said, "Not according to these papers." I said, wow. I said, that one really
Ouch.
hurt. Yeah. Wow. Okay.
That's all right. All the writers in the room got it. Like,
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Thankfully we don't define ourselves as the IRS does,
Yeah, very true. Well, my next question actually may lend itself well to that, because I wanted to ask you, I've been asking people this question. The typical, what is the best advice that you ever got, either in terms of writing or just, creative fulfillment? But then conversely, I've been asking people, what is the greatest or the best advice that you never got, something that you had to learn for yourself and you wish maybe
Mm.
somebody could have told you a little bit sooner?
Wow, that's great. That's an excellent question. So the best advice that I did get was, early on, I remember handing in a story to a teacher and getting back four words on a back page, four words for a story that, had an A+ in red on the front. And it said, read on, write on, but write, WRITE, not RIGHT, right? Read on, write on. And that's emblazoned in my head from the time I was 16 years old, and it's like, I've never forgotten that. And, there's no one of all the changes that have overtaken writing and everything else in our world, no one's ever found a way for a writer to not be a reader. You have to read, you have to write, you have to read, you have to write, and over and over and over again. And I had students who wanted to take shortcuts, who would say, well, I want to be a writer, but, I'm like, well, you need to do a ton of reading and a ton of writing, well, I don't really have the time for that. Well, then, okay, then, good luck with the next thing, But the advice I never got, wow, what a great question. I think I would have liked to have somebody tell me sort of to temper your expectations, that you're in for the long haul, And, I sort of had like academic success when I was, in my early 20s, where I started winning prizes and writing contests and a scholarship and things like that. And creative writing professors were telling me, you're very talented and this and that. So in your 21 or 22-year-old brain, you're thinking like, well, when's the book party,
Right.
And this is most definitely, for me, it's a very long journey, and I'm more excited about writing now, decades later, than I was then. But, I wish somebody had pulled me aside and said, you may be doing other stuff along the way. And I certainly have. I've done a ton of other stuff along the way. But, don't be looking, that you're going to be, getting the brass ring by the time you're 25 or something. If it happens, great. It happened to F. Scott Fitzgerald, but for the rest of us mortals, it's a long haul. And, as I said, I have to write. I think, that feeling that, when you have to write, you have to write, but you're in for the long haul. I think that's what I wish somebody had told me, to, like, be prepared to be patient, be prepared for ups and downs, and be prepared for the long haul.
Sure. Well, I find that very helpful. Actually,
Good.
both parts of that, the best advice you ever got and never got, because I find myself sort of stuck in that read on part of the read on, write on, and I would rather read. Like, someone's going to have to physically pull me out of the stacks to get me to write
Right.
something other than a book review. But I think too, yeah, it is a long game. And then I think, well, eventually maybe I'll put the books down and pick up a piece of paper or break out the laptop.
There you go.
Uh,
Right.
so
Right.
most excellent. And my final question to you, I'm wondering what you can tell us about what you're working on now, because if I understand correctly, you're working on a scripted drama for television and a second novel, in addition to all the other things that occupy your time.
Yes. Yes. So, okay. So let's take the second thing first. I actually was working on a novel before Half the Child, and I put it aside. And that's a novel about uh, in athletic terms, an older man, not really that older in terms of the real world, 38 or 40, who is back in the minor leagues after having had a major league baseball career. And of course, at 38 in baseball terms, if you're in the minor leagues, that's not good. You're on your
Tell
way
you I'm
out.
38.
Well, I haven't looked up, your record online, so I don't know how many years you spent in the major leagues. But
I can barely hit the ball off the.
Okay, T-ball. Yeah, right. So it's about second acts, basically. This is a guy who's trying to decide what the second act is going to be. And he's had some trauma in his life, and he's had, and what is he going to do? He's still a relatively young guy. 38 is young, trust me, but in baseball terms, it's like he's the old man, and he's in the minor leagues with 18 and 19 and 20-year-olds. And, some of them are young enough to be his son, And so, I'm working on that on the side. That's a novel called Bush. But I'm also, I'm sort of, I don't mean to be mysterious or anything, but sort of restricted from saying much, but I'm working on a TV script. And, the interesting thing, even before COVID, but even more so after COVID, as so many people are noting, this is sort of a golden age for television now, particularly through the non-traditional network, stations, that we all grew up with, now, and not just even cable stations, but now there are all these other venues, with Netflix and,
Oh, sure.
and Prime and, and all of that, and Hulu. And so I was talking to a TV producer recently, and even in COVID, things are kind of dark for the movie industry right now because of the distribution end. You can't go to theaters, and so that's obviously hurting movies. But the thing about COVID is, what were so many people doing? Millions of people were staying home and binge watching TV.
Right.
So it really is a golden time for TV. So I don't want to jinx it, but before I was telling you, my timing's always been a little off in a lot of decisions. But I just said to someone recently, well, this is a good time for TV, and the interesting thing about TV, in the old days when you would write a novel, people would say, oh, it's going to be a movie, and people have said that to me about Half the Child, but other people have said, what about a TV series? I've always felt that a well done, good TV series is much closer to a novel than a movie is to a novel. I would have such trouble trying to take a novel and making it a 2-hour movie, but making it a 7 or 8 or 10 episode TV series, yeah, I would love to do that with Half the Child, for example. To me, a short story would make a good movie, and a novel would make a good TV series.
Yeah.
And when you look at so much good TV work that's being done in recent years, to me, so much of it is so much better than so many movies that are in the theaters. There was a time when TV was looked down upon. So things change. It's like we were talking before about self-publishing. That used to be a stigma, and TV used to be a stigma to an extent. It's like, oh, they're working in TV, they can't make it in the movies. Now look how much great work is being done. So I'm always working on a bunch of different things at once and keeping my fingers crossed. But I'll keep you in the loop.
All right, excellent. Well, thank you so much for the great conversation, and I do want to remind people that they need to check out Half the Child, William J. McGee. It's available now, exceptionally well written. So I appreciated the opportunity to read the book and certainly to talk to you about it. And thank you so much for sharing so much of that with me tonight.
Thanks very much. I mean, it was a great discussion, John. I really appreciate it. And the easiest thing for anyone interested in the book is to just go right to the website. It's halfthechild.com. No punctuation or anything like that. So you can learn more about it there, and you can find out how to get it too. But what a great conversation. Thank you. And I have to tell you, this is the first interview I've done. It's Connecticut based. So
Oh, that's so funny.
I've lived in Connecticut now for 16 years. I know it well. And so it's great, all those Connecticut peeps out there. And if the world doesn't get normal soon and we can't get together for readings, I'm happy to do podcasts and blogs and all kinds of stuff like that. So
excellent. I'm like, there's always virtual space, which is great.
Absolutely.
Yeah, check out the book. You will not regret it. I can promise you that. So thank you, Mr. McGee. I'm sure we'll be chatting again soon, and we will knock on wood that TV project takes off. Maybe now is your time. You're coming into it.
Thank you. John, you've been a great host. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode of Central Booking. Thanks for watching, and be sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a thing.